Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Roast into Ceilings podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about different types of feminism or branches of feminism.
I really like the word branches because it gives you that visual of like a tree like splitting off because it really reinforces how multifaceted feminism really is. We kind of have been using feminism as one big word during our podcast, but today we're going to be talking about how important it is to recognize how many different like types there really are.
We're going to be going over only 5 types, but there's so many if you look into it. And it's super interesting. So, I'm going to kick us off with radical feminism. So, what is radical feminism? It's the belief that oppression is caused by the patriarchy only, that's the only factor or the major factor causing sexism, and is sprung from the US civil rights and peace movements in the 1960s. So it kind of exaggerates the all men are bad viewpoint. Like a lot of times when you look at radical feminism, it's a lot of men are causing all of the bad things in my life, and that's kind of the main idea it is now today. It was a little bit different back then, but that's kind of similar. And for some people who believe in radical feminism, they also believe in something called political lesbianism, which was really interesting to me to research, which is basically a phenomenon within feminism, primarily the second wave feminism. I think we'll have another episode talking about waves, but it's claiming that sexual orientation is a choice, and it advocates for lesbianism or for people to become lesbians as a counter to sexism, which was very interesting to me. That's the thing.
Yeah, I have seen a lot more rad fem like ideology on social media recently, which is very strange to me. Because when I was reading about it shortly, they were like, "Oh, rad fem ideologies kind of died down. It's not as widely accepted." And then on open TikTok, I get like slideshows, all like these pro feminism posts that are all super super radical. I think the radical part of it is really saying like we are changing everything. We are completely overhauling everything about how our society is laid out. And that's the only way we can change sexism, which I think is super interesting that's coming back. But there, again, is a lot of criticism we need to put on this ideology. One thing I see a lot is these rad feminists don't tend to include trans women in their activism. They usually exclude them. They're like, oh, but you were born a male, you don't have the same effects of the patriarchy. But when we're talking about intersectionalism and how identity plays a role in feminism, I think it's just really important to consider that.
For sure. And I think it kind of gives feminism almost a bad rep nowadays. Like, I do want this to be kind of an objective, like, take this information and do what you will with it. But I do think that a lot of people, when they think of feminism, they think of radical feminism, thinking that people who believe in feminism think that all men are bad and those type of beliefs, which is not what most people are believing nowadays, I'd say.
It definitely, like, if you're around in, like, 2021 and you told anyone you're a feminist, you're like, oh, you want to kill all men? You think all men suck? You want me dead? You have a dad? Do you have a dad? Do you have brothers? Do you have male? They think, that's what they think feminism is. They think all feminism is this super radical, kill all men ideology. So you're right. It does give feminism a little more of a bad rep. Because this is people's idea of it, they tend to diminish it because they're like, oh, I'm a man. I don't want to die. So feminism wants me dead. So I think it's important to reinforce that that's one branch. That's not all feminism.
For sure.
Okay. The next one I'm going to talk about is liberal feminism. Now, liberal feminism is the one you probably see on your Instagram Explore pages with like the pretty little graphics that say like sexism and like telling you how to battle the patriarchy. That's usually liberal feminism. So liberal feminism emphasizes a woman's individual rights to like autonomy, and they try to combat the patriarchy with things like legal and social constraints. So they're trying to, that's why a lot of protests you'll see are usually liberal feminists, protesting like abortion rights, protesting equal access to pay, equal access to work, opportunities and stuff. They're also very vocal about like sexual harassment, voting rights, and like education, compensation of work, childcare, healthcare, sexual and domestic violence, things like that. So this is usually the feminism that people also tend to think of. It's just very pro women as people kind of vibe. And they also believe that gender stereotypes harm men just as much as they harm women. We've talked a lot about toxic masculinity.
For sure.
We've talked a lot about it in the past, and this is a belief that liberal feminism really picks up. They believe that patriarchy harms everyone. But while this seems like these ideologies are pretty like agreeable, one criticism they get a lot is that it's very ethnocentric. So if you don't know what that means, because I didn't about 20 minutes ago, it basically means that assuming all other cultures are exactly like yours. So while liberal feminisms believe that, women should have the right to like abortion, people have the right to like the same education, same like pay and stuff like that, right? But in other countries, and more like conservative cultures and more like some like Eastern cultures, for example, these are just not the norm. Not even like in a way where you're like, oh, it should be the norm. That's just not like the culture there. So liberal feminism is criticized for kind of basing it around Western girls.
It's kind of only seeing it through one worldview, that when you encounter another woman's mindset, you think that they are being stripped of their rights, but maybe that's just the way they want to live their lives, like that type of thing.
So that's the main criticism liberal feminism gets. But overall, it is, I'd say, the most popular one that you see most often.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like hearing about the criticism of it too, because of course all of these branches of feminism have their pros and cons to it. I think I'm going to jump over to Marxist feminism now. And the main idea of Marxist feminism, it's very rivaling radical feminism, I'd say, because they believe that oppression is caused by financial dependence. So it's kind of moving away from that patriarchy idea and seeing it as a combination of things rather than just one thing. And they really believe that there's a lot of exploitation through capitalism and ownership. And of course, if you know what Marxism is without the feminist piece of it, it's the like analyzing the impact of the ruling class on laborers, right? So it's kind of looking at it through a woman's perspective of how capitalism targets women. And something I read that was really interesting was the warm bath theory. So the idea that a man works, right, and a woman stays at home. And when a man comes home from a hard day at work, he relaxes into his family like a warm bath. And it would take the stress away and refresh him for the next day at work. But oftentimes this becomes him coming home and taking out his stress onto the woman. So one of the criticisms of Marxism is that even if we reverted to communism or took away capitalism, that there would still be like an internal patriarchy, like inside the household rather than outside the household.
I think that's super interesting. I think we talked in the last episode, maybe a few back, not quite sure, about how financial abuse is also something we need to recognize. And I think that's something that Marxist feminism does address, like based on what we just said. I also think it's really interesting because usually when we think about sexism, we think like, oh, the patriarchy, like the systemically, like socially, this is why people don't like women. But I think it's interesting that there's other factors we need to consider, like money, like capitalism, like how the economy is structured and not just how like the social system is structured. So I think that's really, really cool. And I did not know that Karl Marx was a feminist. But I will now be talking a little bit about ecofeminism. I thought this was so cool when I was reading about it because I've never heard the term ecofeminism before. So ecofeminism, environmental feminism, it talks about how historically and present day oppression of women is very similar to the oppression of the environment. So they'll talk about how patriarchal societies have used the same methods to dominate like the planet's resources and like abuse like our environment, and those are the same tactics and methods they use to control women, which I think is so interesting because I've never ever thought about this before. Like kind of things like limiting the resources of the earth, limiting the resources of women, like controlling their freedoms and stuff like that, and like overusing some like the resources. These are all things that ecofeminists have talked about how they are super similar between the earth and just women. This is so cool, and I want to read so much more about it because I never thought that feminism, which is very like human based, like very like human to human connection, could also be human to earth connected, which is so cool.
I love how they're connecting these two super big issues we have right now, with like climate change. And it also makes me think of like the term Mother Earth, like maybe that has some type of connection to it. That's so interesting.
Definitely. And I love how they incorporate climate activism alongside like their feminist activism because again, like you said, two huge problems, two huge topics, and they're kind of finding the solution to them as one thing. So sick.
I love that. So interconnected. Um, okay, I'll move on to our last one, I think, which is difference feminism. I think this is the one that I resonate the most with, although I do need to learn more about it. I don't know too much, but it's basically linking intersectionality with feminism. So recognizing that the severity of oppression depends on many factors other than gender, like race. So that feminism and oppression is not the same for every woman. It differs depending on culture, race, worldviews, how you're raised, and everything like that. The approach arose in the 1980s and 1990s in efforts to kind of revalue qualities that were traditionally devalued as feminism, like being caring, feeling, or like being emotional. But one big criticism it does have is that it kind of weakens feminism, is what a lot of people say, because you're kind of splitting women into these different factions, which is what we don't want.
I think it's a pretty clear like kind of opposing approach to liberal feminism. Like I mentioned how people criticize liberal feminism for being ethnocentric, and I think difference feminism, like you mentioned, is trying to address that by proving like all women are different in cultures all around the world. Intersectional feminism, there's a lot of different types of this. Like I know black feminism is also like a huge one that has risen in the past decades too, where it addresses how being black and being a woman work hand in hand. And also, like you mentioned that this is the one you kind of feel like you agree with the most. And I think it's important to address that you don't have to be one of these things. You don't have to believe in, like,
Yeah.
I am a Marxist feminism, that's it. Like, me personally, I can find myself believing with parts of all of these and also disagreeing with parts of all of these. It's kind of like, like a little mix and match bundle kind of thing going on. Like, with radical feminism, I can believe in that, they believe like the porn industry is really bad for women. I can believe in that, but I don't believe in political lesbianism, right? And then for Marxist approaches, I can believe that, like you mentioned, the warm bath theory. Yeah, I can see that, but also I think that the patriarchy is also involved, like things like that, right? So I think it's super cool how you can just kind of like take whatever branch you feel.
I love that you brought that up because I feel like there's so many different types of feminism because people take pieces that they believe in and kind of structure their own belief once they've done this research and had their own experiences related to these things. So I love that you brought that up, that you can take pieces and create your own value there.
So like if I really wanted, I could just take the pieces I agree with and create like Maggie feminism, right? And that's like my branch.
I would follow Maggie feminism.
And I think Maggie feminism and Isabella feminism would be similar, but again, different branches because everyone believes in different things. But it's important to educate yourself on all of these, so you can see, like, again, feminism is not what's the opposite of multifaceted? One-faceted. Feminism is not that.
I love that. Thank you for listening, guys.
Thank you for listening.